You have been studied, not by scientists, not by professionals operating with instruments and methodology and the formal architecture of research, by the people in your daily life, the ones who share your spaces, your dynamics, your history, who have been running a continuous, instinctive, extraordinarily precise experiment on your psychology since the moment they first discovered that you could be moved. That something they said or did or withheld produced a visible change in you. That a specific input, applied to a specific location in your emotional architecture, generated a specific and reliable output. They did not plan this. They did not sit down and design the experiment with conscious intent. The human nervous system runs this experiment automatically, on every person it encounters, from the first interaction forward. Because the ability to predict how another person will respond to pressure is one of the oldest and most fundamental survival mechanisms the brain possesses. They found your mechanism. They have been using it ever since. Every reaction you produced, every moment of visible frustration, every defensive explanation, every emotional display that confirmed the provocation had landed was data, filed, integrated into the working model of who you are and how you function, returned to whenever the situation called for a specific output from you, not maliciously, instinctively. The way water returns to the channels it has already carved, not because it decided to, but because the path exists and the path is easier than creating a new one. You are the channel. Your reaction is the water. And the people who have learned to direct it have not been doing something extraordinary. They have been doing something entirely ordinary, using a mechanism you left accessible, in a location you never thought to protect, producing results you kept confirming were achievable. What happens when you close the channel? What happens to the water, to the people, to the dynamics, to the carefully constructed systems of influence that have been running on the reliable fuel of your predictable emotional output? When the output stops, when the mechanism they mapped, tested, and learned to deploy with increasing efficiency suddenly produces nothing. When the pressure they apply, with the confident expectation of a specific response, meets instead the absolute, architectural, permanent silence of a man who has removed the response from the available options entirely. 7 things happen, in sequence, with a psychological precision that most men never witness because most men never maintain the silence long enough to watch all 7 complete themselves. 7 specific, observable, deeply revealing phenomena that occur in the people who were running on your reaction, the moment the reaction permanently stops. The first one begins immediately, and it will show you something about the people around you that no confrontation, no conversation, and no amount of direct observation could ever have revealed as clearly as what their behavior produces the moment they discover the mechanism no longer works. The first thing they do is push harder. Not because they are malicious, not because they have consciously identified that your reaction has been withdrawn and decided to intensify the effort to recover it, because the mechanism worked before, and in the absence of any other explanation for why it is not working now, the instinctive conclusion of a system that has been successfully running on pressure is that the problem is insufficient pressure. The lever produced the result last time. The lever is not producing the result this time. Therefore, with the automatic logic of a system that has not yet received the information that the mechanism itself has changed, the correct response is to apply the lever harder. So they escalate. The provocation becomes more direct, the criticism sharper, the emotional manipulation more sophisticated, deploying the triggers that worked most reliably in the past, the ones aimed at the specific fractures they mapped most accurately during the period when your reaction was still available for study. The guilt that previously produced visible discomfort, the disappointment that previously produced the defensive explanation, the withdrawal of approval that previously produced the compliance they were applying pressure to generate. All of it arrives with increased force, increased frequency, and increased precision, because the system has determined that more pressure is the variable that needs adjustment. Watch this with the cold, analytical distance of a man who understands exactly what he is observing. Because the escalation is not a threat, it is a revelation. It is the most accurate diagnostic of the nature of their original interest in you that you will ever receive, because people who engaged with you for genuine reasons do not escalate when you stop reacting. They ask, they express concern, they modify their approach. The escalation, the specific behavioral pattern of applying increasing pressure to recover a response that has been withdrawn, is the signature of a dynamic that was never about connection. It was about extraction. And the escalation, arriving precisely when and how it does, is the system revealing its own architecture with a clarity that all the years of its ordinary operation had successfully concealed. The escalation also reveals something about the mechanism itself. Every increase in pressure that produces no response is simultaneously a confirmation that the response has genuinely been removed, and a further refinement of your understanding of what the system actually required from you. Each failed escalation is data, delivered not by your analysis, but by their behavior, about the specific nature of the dependency they had built on your reaction. And this data, accumulating through the escalation sequence without costing you a single word or a single visible response, is more precise than anything they would have told you willingly. Hold your position. Do not mistake the escalation for evidence that you should respond. It is evidence that you should not. The escalation is the system in distress, running its highest intensity version of the protocol that used to work, burning through its reserves of leverage in the increasingly desperate attempt to recreate the output it depended on. And a system burning through its leverage reserves while producing no return is a system that is, with each failed attempt, becoming less capable of the next one. The silence is winning. Not through aggression, not through confrontation, through the patient, absolute, structurally maintained refusal to provide the one thing the escalation was designed to extract. And what the escalation cannot extract, it cannot use. And what it cannot use, it eventually stops attempting to acquire, because every system, no matter how persistent, eventually performs the calculation that the cost of continued effort exceeds the probability of eventual return. But they do not reach that calculation immediately. Before the system accepts that the mechanism has permanently changed, something else happens, something quieter than the escalation, something that occurs beneath the behavioral surface, in the interior of a person who has been applying increasing pressure to a lever that is no longer connected to anything, and who is beginning, for the first time, to encounter the specific and deeply uncomfortable experience of not knowing what is happening. The escalation produced nothing. Not a fraction of the expected output, not the visible frustration they were calibrated to detect, not the defensive explanation that would have confirmed the pressure registered, not even the cold, deliberate performance of composure that would still communicate through its very deliberateness that something was being suppressed. Nothing. The mechanism was applied at its highest intensity, in its most refined form, aimed at the most reliably productive fracture points. And the result was the specific, unnerving, model-breaking silence of a man who appears to have genuinely not been reached. And now something shifts in them. Not dramatically, not in any form that would be immediately visible to a casual observer. In the specific, interior way that a person shifts when the operating model they have been relying on to navigate a relationship has just returned a result that the model cannot account for. The model said, apply this pressure, receive this response. The model was built on data, on the accumulated evidence of every interaction in which the pressure was applied and the response was delivered, confirming that the model was accurate and that it could be trusted for future predictions. The model has now failed, not partially, not in a way that suggests a minor recalibration is needed, completely. in a way that raises a question the model has no existing answer for. What is this person now? Because the person they knew, the one their model was built to predict, produced reactions, produced explanations, produced the emotional availability that their behavior was calibrated to engage with. The person currently in front of them is producing none of those things, is sitting or standing or moving through the interaction with a quality of complete interior absence that the model was never designed to process. And the absence of a processable signal in a system that has been successfully reading signals for the entire duration of the relationship produces the specific, instinctive, deeply uncomfortable response that the human nervous system generates when it encounters something it cannot categorize. It destabilizes, not in the theatrical sense of visible breakdown, in the operational sense of a system whose predictions are failing and whose failure to predict is generating the specific internal experience that failed predictions always generate in human psychology. The cold, spreading, involuntary uncertainty of a person who no longer knows where they stand in a dynamic they believe they understood completely. Watch what this does to their behavior. The confidence with which they deployed the escalation begins to contract. The pressure that arrived with the certainty of someone who knows the lever works is replaced, gradually and visibly, with the hesitancy of someone who no longer knows whether the lever is connected to anything. The social ease, the specific, slightly elevated quality of behavior that people display in dynamics they feel they control, begins to modulate toward something more careful, more observant, more oriented toward reading you than toward managing you. Because the management protocol has failed, and the system has been forced, by the failure of its predictions, into a different operational mode. It has shifted from managing to studying. And here is what makes this shift so precisely revealing. When they were managing you, when the mechanism was working and the predictions were accurate and the dynamic was running according to the model they had built, they were not truly seeing you. They were seeing the model. The reactions, the patterns, the predictable emotional sequences that the model described and that the mechanism reliably produced. The actual you, the interior reality of who you are beneath the reactions they had learned to generate, was entirely invisible to them, because the reactions were providing such a complete and reliable portrait that there was no need to look deeper. The silence forces them to look deeper. And what they find when they look is something that the model completely failed to capture, because the model was built on your reactions, not on you. The man beneath the reactions. The interior that the reactions had been inadvertently providing a continuous distraction from. The specific, unreadable, architecturally settled quality of a person who is not producing a signal, because there is nothing happening in him that requires one. And this quality, this genuine, biological, unperformed interior stillness that the silence has been revealing, is something they have no existing category for. They do not know what they are looking at. And not knowing what you are looking at, in the psychology of human social dynamics, is one of the most powerful positions another person can occupy relative to you. Because it means your predictions have failed, your model is broken, and the confident, management-oriented stance that successful prediction enables has been replaced by something that serves your interests and theirs in very different ways. Their uncertainty is your authority. But the destabilization is not the deepest consequence of your silence. What emerges from the ruins of their failed model, the behavior they begin to produce when the management protocol has collapsed, and the studying protocol is yielding results they cannot interpret, reveals something about the nature of human social psychology that most men never witness, because most men never create the conditions that make it visible. Something biological happens next. Not psychological in the constructed, deliberate sense of a person who has decided to change their approach. Biological, at the level beneath decision-making, beneath conscious strategy, beneath the social persona they have been maintaining throughout the escalation and the destabilization, at the level where the nervous system operates automatically, without permission from the identity that believes it is in control. The human nervous system is a mirroring machine. It has been since before language existed, since the period in human development when the ability to read and replicate the emotional and physiological state of the people around you was not a social skill, but a survival mechanism. The capacity to feel what the dominant presence in the room was feeling, to match the energy of what could not be predicted or controlled, to attune to the frequency that the environment was broadcasting as the safest available signal. That ancient mechanism is still running. In everyone. And it runs most powerfully in the presence of a signal it cannot resist, the signal of a person who is producing absolute interior stillness in a context where emotional activation was expected. Because stillness, in the architecture of human neurological response, does not read as neutral. It reads as dominant. As the specific, ancient, prelinguistic signal of a presence that is so fundamentally settled in itself that the social turbulence around it has produced no detectable interior response. And the nervous system of every person in proximity to that signal does what nervous systems have always done in the presence of something they cannot destabilize. They begin to attune to it. Watch this happen in real time, and you will witness one of the most precise and revealing phenomena available in human social dynamics. The person who arrived at the interaction with elevated energy, the heightened emotional activation of someone who was deploying a tested mechanism with confident expectation of a specific result, begins, gradually and involuntarily, to modulate downward. The voice that was sharp becomes less sharp. The posture that was forward-leaning becomes less aggressive. The pace of speech that was calibrated for provocation begins to slow toward the pace of the person who is not being provoked, not because they have decided to become calmer, because your calm is the only signal in the environment strong enough to override the one they arrived with. You have become the dominant frequency, not through aggression, not through the visible, effortful performance of composure that still communicates effort and therefore still reveals investment, through the genuine, interior, biologically transmitted signal of a man who has nothing in this interaction that requires a reaction, and whose absence of reaction is broadcasting that fact at a level that bypasses every social defense the other person possesses. They cannot choose not to receive this signal. They cannot decide to remain at their original frequency in the presence of a more powerful one. The nervous system does not consult the identity before it mirrors. It simply mirrors. And what it mirrors in this case is precisely what most men have been trying to project their entire lives through performance. Authority. The specific, unmanufactured, neurologically transmitted authority of a man who is not competing for dominance in the interaction, because he is already operating at an altitude the interaction cannot reach. The people in the room feel this, not as an intellectual conclusion, but as a physical experience. A shift in the atmospheric pressure of the dynamic. A gravitational reorientation toward the presence that is producing the most coherent signal. And the person who arrived to apply a mechanism finds themselves, inexplicably and without having made any conscious decision, speaking differently, moving differently, engaging with a care and a measure that was entirely absent from their original approach. You change the room without saying a word. But the mirroring only captures what is happening on the surface of their adjustment. Beneath it, in the interior territory that the failed mechanism and the involuntary mirroring have now left without its usual defenses, something is being exposed that no amount of deliberate social management could have revealed. Something that your reactions had been inadvertently protecting from view for the entire duration of the dynamic. Your reaction was their cover. This is the thing most men never realize, because they are too focused on what their reaction cost them to examine what it provided to the person who provoked it. Every time you reacted, you did something for the provocateur that they could not have done for themselves. You redirected the attention of everyone present, including your own, from the nature of what they were doing to the nature of your response to it. The room that was watching the interaction did not watch the manipulation. It watched the reaction. The dynamic that was operating beneath the surface did not become visible. It remained concealed behind the far more compelling spectacle of your visible emotional engagement with the provocation. Your reaction was not just the output they were extracting. It was the curtain they were hiding behind. Remove the curtain. What stands behind it, exposed now to the full, unmediated observation of everyone present, including, most devastatingly, themselves, is the raw mechanism of what they were doing, stripped of the reaction that gave it cover, standing in the light of its own unmediated performance with no spectacle to redirect attention from its actual nature. The manipulation that felt sophisticated in the context of your reaction looks, in the context of your silence, exactly like what it is. The criticism that presented itself as legitimate feedback, when it produced visible defensive engagement from you, reveals itself, in the silence, as the precisely targeted instrument of psychological management it always was. The emotional withdrawal that felt, when it produced visible anxiety in you, like the legitimate expression of genuine hurt, reveals itself, in your indifference, as the deliberate lever it always functioned as. They cannot hide what they are doing when you stop reacting to it. And this revelation operates in multiple directions simultaneously. The room sees it. The people who were watching the dynamic and reading your reaction as the primary signal now have their attention freed to observe what generated it. But more precisely and more permanently, they see it. The person running the mechanism watches it operate, without the feedback of your reaction to confirm that it is working, and discovers something about what they are doing that the feedback had been successfully concealing from them. Most people who operate manipulative dynamics do not fully recognize them as such, because the recognition requires seeing the mechanism from the outside, and the outside position is only available when the mechanism is operating without producing its expected result. Your silence gives them the outside position, forces it on them, and what they see from that position is frequently more disturbing to them than anything you could have said or done in response. Because you could have been wrong, you could have been defensive or disproportionate or reading malice into behavior that had a more innocent explanation. But your silence is not an interpretation. It is not an accusation they can argue with or a characterization they can contest. It is simply the absence of the result their behavior was designed to produce. And that absence, reflecting back at them from the mirror of your non-response, shows them the behavior itself with the cold, unedited accuracy of a recording they cannot dispute. Some will recognize what they are seeing and recoil from it. Others will recognize it and double down, which is itself the most revealing response available, because it removes the final ambiguity about the nature of their original intent. Either way, the silence has produced something that years of direct engagement never could: the complete, accurate, unmediated visibility of what the dynamic actually was. And that visibility, once achieved, cannot be undone. They have seen themselves without the cover your reaction provided. And the man who forced that vision, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through the patient, absolute maintenance of his own silence, has permanently changed the informational landscape of the relationship. He knows what he is dealing with. They know he knows. And that shared, unspoken, permanently altered understanding of the nature of what has been operating, combined with what your silence is simultaneously producing in the structure of the dynamic itself, creates the conditions for something that most men spend their entire lives trying to manufacture through force, through argument, through the exhausting and ultimately counterproductive effort of fighting their way to a position that silence produces automatically. Power flows toward the person who needs the interaction least. This is not philosophy. It is not the motivational restatement of a principle that sounds compelling, but dissolves under the pressure of actual application. It is the precise, operational, mechanically accurate description of how social dynamics redistribute authority in real time. Every interaction between two people involves an implicit negotiation of who is more invested in the outcome of the exchange, who has more to gain from a specific result, who would be more damaged by the interaction ending without the resolution they needed it to produce. And the answer to that question, the implicit, instinctive, continuously updated answer that both parties are running, and that governs the distribution of authority in the dynamic, determines, with a reliability that no performance of confidence can override, who occupies the power position in the exchange. You needed nothing from the interaction. They needed your reaction. The moment your reaction was withdrawn and the need became visible, not stated, not acknowledged, but behaviorally demonstrated through the escalation and the destabilization and the mirroring and the self-revelation, the negotiation concluded, not with a declaration, with the quiet, automatic, structurally inevitable redistribution of authority toward the person whose continued participation in the dynamic is no longer guaranteed, toward the person who demonstrated, through their silence and their indifference, that the interaction could end without producing anything they required, toward you. Feel what this inversion actually produces. Not the abstract intellectual satisfaction of knowing you occupy the power position, the specific, physical, room-level experience of a dynamic that has restructured itself around your presence rather than around their demands. The conversations that previously orbited their agenda now orbit yours, not because you have asserted control, but because the vacuum your silence created pulled the center of gravity toward the only stable point available. The interactions that previously required your continuous management now require theirs, because the mechanism they were using to manage you has failed, and the management deficit created by its failure has redistributed itself entirely onto the person who was deploying it. They are working harder than you now. This is the inversion in its most precise form. The person who was extracting your energy, who was consuming your reactions, your explanations, your emotional availability as the fuel that kept the dynamic running in the direction that served them, is now the person expending energy, expending it on the escalation that produced nothing, on the destabilization of a model that no longer functions, on the involuntary mirroring of a frequency they cannot override, on the exposure of a mechanism they can no longer hide, on the management of a dynamic that has slipped entirely out of the configuration they constructed, and that is now organizing itself around different principles entirely. You became the center without claiming the center, not through assertion, through absence, the specific, decisive, architecturally complete absence of the one thing the dynamic required to continue running in the direction it had been running. Your reaction created a vacuum that the fundamental physics of human social dynamics filled in the only way available to it, by pulling everything toward the nearest stable point, by restructuring the dynamic around the presence that was not moved by it, by installing, in the position that your reaction had been inadvertently vacating through its continuous availability, the authority of a man whose investment in the interaction's outcome could not be located or leveraged. This is power without performance. This is the dynamic inversion that no amount of confidence training, no collection of psychological tactics, and no force of will can produce, because it is not produced by anything you do. It is produced by the precise, sustained, absolute removal of what you were doing. The silence is not the absence of action. It is the most complete and most irreversible action available to a man who understands what has been running on his reaction and has decided, permanently and without announcement, to cut the supply. But the inversion of the dynamic is only the visible consequence of something that is simultaneously occurring at a deeper level, in the way they now see you, in the calculation they now run when they consider how to engage with you, in the permanent, structural revision of their assessment of who they are actually dealing with. That revision is where the next phenomenon lives. and it is the one that makes everything that follows possible. You are no longer who they thought you were. Not in the superficial sense of a reputation that has been updated by a single impressive performance, in the structural sense of a foundational miscategorization that has been forcibly corrected, permanently, without appeal, and with the specific irreversibility that only comes from a revision driven not by what you told them but by what they directly, inescapably experienced. They placed you in a category. The category had a specific set of properties: predictable, reactive, emotionally accessible, manageable through the reliable application of tested pressure. The category felt accurate because the evidence supported it continuously. Every reaction you produced was a data point confirming the classification. Every explanation you offered was a validation of the model. Every moment of visible emotional engagement was a signal that the category was correct and that the behaviors the category permitted were justified. The silence broke the category. Not bent it, not revised it at the margins. Broke it, completely and without possibility of restoration, because the revision was not produced by your argument or your assertion or your performance of a different identity, all of which can be dismissed or reframed or weighted out by a person committed to the original classification. It was produced by behavior that the original classification structurally cannot account for. A man in the category they assigned you does not maintain absolute silence under the pressure they applied, does not remain unmoved through the escalation, does not produce the specific, unreadable, architecturally settled quality of someone for whom the entire apparatus of their management approach has simply failed to register as a significant event. The man they thought they knew would have reacted. You did not react. And that gap between the man the category described and the man currently standing in front of them producing none of the outputs the category predicted is not a discrepancy they can explain away. It is a fundamental failure of the model that forces the only available conclusion. The model was wrong. The category was wrong. The person they believed they had accurately classified is not the person they classified. And the question that this conclusion generates, if not who they thought you were, then who, is the question that permanently restructures the cognitive position they occupy relative to you. They move from certainty to uncertainty. From the confident, management-oriented stance of a person who believes they understand who they are dealing with, to the careful, observational, distinctly less comfortable position of a person who has just discovered that they do not. And this transition, from certainty to uncertainty in their assessment of your nature, produces a shift in their behavior that is not temporary, not situational, and not reversible by anything they subsequently do or discover. Uncertainty generates caution. Not respect in the performed sense of a social ritual they are executing because the situation demands it. Genuine caution, the specific, instinctive behavioral modulation of a system that has just discovered it, is operating in terrain it does not have an accurate map for. They begin to choose their approach to you more carefully, to measure what they say in your presence with a precision that was entirely absent when they believed the category was accurate and the mechanism was reliable. To treat interactions with you as exchanges that require more attention, more care, more operational intelligence than the interactions they were conducting under the previous classification. Because the previous classification permitted carelessness. Categories that are stable and predictable are categories that require no ongoing attentiveness. The model runs automatically, and the behavior it permits can be deployed without the cognitive overhead of genuine observation. The category you have now broken required that attentiveness be suspended, because the prediction was so reliable that observation was redundant. What you have done by breaking the category is reinstall the requirement for genuine attentiveness in every subsequent interaction they have with you. You have made yourself, to their nervous system, and to their social cognition, something that requires watching. Not with suspicion, with the specific quality of attention that anything genuinely unknown generates. The focused, careful, fundamentally respectful attention of a person who has learned that the terrain is more complex than their map suggested, and who has adjusted their movement through it accordingly. You became unknown to them. And unknown is the most powerful social position available, because known things are manageable, predictable, and safe to treat with the carelessness that familiarity permits. Unknown things are none of these. Unknown things generate the specific, instinctive behavioral response of a system that has been forced to abandon its operating model and has not yet constructed a replacement. And that response, in the context of human social dynamics, is the one that most closely resembles what men have been trying to produce through performance their entire lives. It resembles respect. But the perceptual shift, as complete and as permanent as it is, addresses only how they see you. The final phenomenon, the one that emerges from the accumulated weight of everything the silence has produced, addresses something larger, more durable, and more consequential than their perception of you in any single interaction. It addresses the structure of everything between you going forward. Relationships are not static agreements. They are dynamic systems, continuously adjusting, continuously redistributing weight, continuously reorganizing themselves around the behaviors, the patterns, and the investment levels of the people inside them. The structure that existed before your silence was not something that was negotiated and finalized, and then maintained by mutual commitment to the terms. It was something that emerged from the behavioral patterns both parties were running, from the continuous interaction of what they were doing and what you were doing in response, and that reorganized itself continuously in accordance with those patterns. The structure was downstream of the behavior, always. And the behavior that was producing the structure most powerfully was not theirs. It was yours. Your continuous availability was the primary structural element. Your predictable reactions were the architecture around which the dynamic organized itself. Your reliable emotional engagement was the gravity that kept everything in its existing configuration, pulling the center of the relationship toward the needs, the demands, and the management strategies of the people who had learned that your gravity would maintain the structure they required. You were not a participant in the relationship structure. You were its foundation, and foundations do not negotiate. Foundations do not set terms. Foundations simply hold, providing the structural support that allows everything built on top of them to persist in its existing form without having to earn the right to do so. Your silence removed the foundation. And when the foundation shifts, everything built on it must either find new support or collapse into the configuration that the new structural reality permits. The relationship cannot maintain its previous form in the absence of the behavioral patterns that created that form, because the form was never stable in itself, never self-supporting, never capable of persisting without the continuous input of your reaction as the organizing principle. Remove the organizing principle, and the structure becomes what it always was beneath the surface. A negotiation. An ongoing, dynamic, continuously renegotiated distribution of terms between two parties whose relative positions, whose needs, whose investment levels, whose willingness to absorb the costs of the dynamic, have now been fundamentally altered by what your silence revealed and produced. And in this negotiation, conducted not through words, but through the slow, behavioral, structurally inevitable adjustment of a system finding its new equilibrium, you are no longer the foundation. You are the architect, the man who decides what the new structure permits, not through declaration, not with a dramatic announcement that transforms your boundary into a performance they can critique and negotiate. Through the quiet, absolute, continuously maintained reality of a man who has removed the behaviors that were producing the old structure and has not reinstated them, who has allowed the dynamic to collapse to its actual level, The level that the withdrawal of his reaction and his availability and his predictability has revealed as the true, unproductive foundation of what was being built on top of him. And who is now, from the position of a man who understands the actual structural reality, deciding what terms he is willing to provide support for going forward. Some relationships cannot survive this restructuring. They were built entirely on the foundation of your reaction, had no other load-bearing element, no genuine reciprocity, no exchange that would justify its continuation once the one-sided extraction that had been masquerading as connection was accurately identified. These relationships do not end because you ended them. They reveal themselves as already concluded, as dynamics that had been persisting past their actual expiration through the artificial structural support of your continuous, unpriced, unexamined availability. Their conclusion is not a loss. It is a correction, the removal of a weight that was consuming structural resources it had never earned, and that was preventing the construction of something better in the space it occupied. Other relationships survive, transformed, because some of the people who were operating within the old structure, who were behaving in ways that the structure permitted without examining whether those ways were accurate or justified or genuinely reflective of who they were at their best, are capable of adjustment, of renegotiating their position within a structure that no longer permits the carelessness that your previous availability subsidized, of becoming, in the context of a dynamic that now requires them to earn what they previously received automatically, something closer to what the relationship required them to be all along. These relationships become real, perhaps for the first time, because the reality of a relationship, its actual structure, its genuine terms, its honest distribution of investment and return, cannot be assessed while one party is subsidizing its continuation through behavioral patterns that mask the true exchange taking place. The silence removes the subsidy, exposes the exchange, and what survives the exposure is not what was there before. It is what was always possible, beneath the distortion of your reaction, if the actual terms of the dynamic had ever been allowed to become visible. What restructures is not your relationship with them. It is their relationship with the truth of what was happening between you. And that truth, once visible, once the silence has held long enough for the structure to find its actual level, and for both parties to see clearly what that level is, cannot be unseen, by you or by them. And the restructuring that follows is not something you managed or engineered or forced into existence through any act of will or strategy or confrontation. It is simply what remained when you stopped providing the reaction that had been preventing reality from becoming visible. 7 phenomena. Not theories, not the philosophical abstractions of men who observed human nature from a distance and constructed models that sound compelling in the reading and dissolve in the application. Documented, observable, sequentially occurring phenomena in the nervous systems, the behaviors, the social cognition, and the relational structures of every person who has ever depended on your reaction as the resource their approach to you required. 7 things that happen in order when the resource is permanently withdrawn. 7 revelations that the silence produces about them, about the dynamic, about the actual nature of what has been operating in the space between you, that no amount of direct engagement, no quality of confrontation, and no investment of explicit effort could have generated with equivalent accuracy or equivalent permanence. The silence did all of it. Without a word, without a performance, without the expenditure of a single unit of the energy that the old dynamic was continuously consuming, and that is now, in its withdrawal, available for everything the noise was preventing you from building. Now understand what separates the men who will experience these 7 phenomena from the men who will only read about them. The silence must be held. This is where 99% of men fail, not in the decision to stop reacting, which feels clear and achievable in the elevated state produced by the understanding of what the reaction has been costing them, but in the maintenance of the silence through the specific and carefully sequenced pressure that the phenomena themselves generate. The escalation arrives, and something in the chest says this is the moment. This is the intensity that justifies response. Hold. The destabilization produces in them a vulnerability that triggers the caregiving instinct, the impulse to relieve the discomfort of a person who appears to be suffering from your silence. Hold. The mirroring creates an atmosphere so altered from what the interaction began as that the pressure to acknowledge the shift, to speak into the new silence that has opened between you, becomes almost physical. Hold. The self-revelation produces something that looks like an opening for the confrontation that would finally address what has been operating, and the confrontation feels justified, earned, overdue. Hold. Every phenomenon is also a test. A specific, calibrated pressure point designed, not deliberately, but functionally, to recover the reaction that the silence withdrew. The escalation tests your commitment by raising the cost of continued silence. The destabilization tests your compassion by making the cost visible in their discomfort. The mirroring tests your patience by making the new dynamic feel stable enough that breaking the silence seems safe. The self-revelation tests your discipline by making the confrontation seem productive. And the inversion tests your confidence by making the power feel secure enough that you can afford to acknowledge it. The silence is the answer to every test. Not because silence is always the correct response in every context, but because, in this specific sequence, with these specific phenomena unfolding in this specific order, any response that recovers the reaction reinstalls the mechanism. Any acknowledgement that breaks the silence resets the experiment to day one. Any confrontation that delivers the visible emotional engagement, the escalation was designed to produce confirms that the lever remains connected, and that sufficient pressure can still reach the interior that the silence had sealed. Hold the silence, and let the 7 phenomena run their complete sequence, because the sequence is not complete until the 7th phenomenon has restructured the relationship at the level of its actual architecture, and that restructuring requires the silence to have been maintained long enough for the structure to reveal its true load-bearing capacity without the artificial support of your reaction. The 1% will hold it. Not dramatically, not as a visible performance of psychological discipline that is itself a form of reaction, a statement, a posture, a communication addressed to the person who is watching. In the private, invisible, daily commitment of a man who has understood what the silence is building, and who has decided that what it builds is worth more than the temporary relief of breaking it, who catches the impulse to explain and holds, who feels the pull toward the confrontation that feels justified and holds, who sits inside the expanding discomfort of a dynamic in transformation and does not reach for the familiar, costly, structurally destructive comfort of the reaction that would stop the discomfort immediately and undo everything the silence had produced. They will watch all 7 phenomena complete themselves. They will feel the escalation arrive and pass without leaving a mark. They will observe the destabilization with the clinical detachment of a man reading the diagnostic output of a system, revealing its own architecture. They will receive the mirroring as confirmation that the frequency has changed, not as an invitation to speak into the new atmosphere it created. They will watch the self-revelation with the cold, almost compassionate accuracy of a man who is seeing something clearly for the first time and is choosing to file the intelligence rather than act on it immediately. They will inhabit the inversion with the unhurried ease of a man who has not claimed the center, but has allowed the physics of the dynamic to place him there. They will witness the perceptual shift without performing awareness of it. And they will allow the restructuring to complete itself, quietly, architecturally, without announcement, into the configuration that the silence made possible and that the reaction would have permanently prevented. These men will not need to fight for their dignity. They will not need to argue for their worth, negotiate for their respect, or demonstrate through any act of visible performance that they are men who cannot be managed, manipulated, or reduced by the mechanisms that have been running on their reactions. The silence will have already done all of that, not as a statement, but as a structural reality. Not as a claim, but as the demonstrated, behaviorally confirmed, 7 phenomena validated fact of a man who removed his reaction and watched what the removal produced. And what it produced was the one thing that no amount of performance could have manufactured. The truth. The cold, architectural, permanent truth of every dynamic they were inside, visible now, unambiguous now, restructured now around its actual load-bearing capacity, rather than the artificial support of their continuous, unexamined, enormously costly reaction. The ghost protocol is not a tactic deployed in moments of conflict. It is the permanent operating frequency of a man who has understood what his reaction has been powering, and who has made the irreversible decision to redirect that power toward the construction of something the noise was preventing. Subscribe, not for the content, for the architecture, for the systematic, phenomenon by phenomenon, silence by silence construction of a man who has removed the mechanism that was making him readable, manageable, and perpetually available to the dynamics that were consuming what he should have been building. When you stop reacting, something breaks in them. What breaks in you is different. It is the last chain. The cold work continues.